Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about this whole Big Bang article, the one thing that you don't mention, right, in it is that the Big Bang wasn't just a creation of matter, right? We know now that space-time is a thing. Space and time are inextricable from each other. Time cannot exist outside of space and vice versa, right?
We now think. This is the best theory.
Yeah, all of this is theory. I mean, the Big Bang itself is one theory. There are several other ones. Some of them say that there's an eternal, there's a big crunch and all that. But right now, the most commonly accepted one is the Big Bang. And that's what you wrote about a universe with a beginning. So that's what I wanted to talk about. So it was actually the beginning of space and time, which means that at the time of the Big Bang, there was no such thing as time. And when there's no time, there is no before.
Agreed.
Right? There is no cause, there's no effect, because cause comes before effect. They have a temporal relationship. And I know that there are philosophical things that say, one can happen before the other and so on. We're talking about stuff with evidence. Metaphysics, to me, everybody brings up metaphysics, and that's a whole different discussion. But when you have if you don't have a before and you don't have cause and effect, right, that's one thing that people don't acknowledge. Now, if time was eternal, right, and Allah is eternal, then one thing cannot precede the other, which means that Allah could not have preceded time. He could not have created time. The whole idea of something creating time doesn't make sense anyway, because if time doesn't exist, you can't conceivably create it, because you'd have to precede it, and you can't precede something unless time exists, because that they have a temporal relationship. So, so this is one thing that. Sorry, go ahead.
No. Sorry. Finish your point.
Right.
Please.
So one of my question to you is basically, how do you acknowledge that if there is no? You're standing on top of the North Pole, you're on the North Pole, and someone says, "Can you walk north?" You'll be like, that question doesn't make sense. How does that? Yeah. How can I walk north? The point is right between my feet. So it's the same thing when you say that if you're going by the theory that the universe had a beginning, the Big Bang was that beginning of space and time. If I say what happened before the Big Bang, or what created it, cause and effect, how things come about, none of those questions actually even make sense. So how could something be created if there's no time to create it in?
So the first thing I would say is that I'm speaking now from a purely, in a sense, I could be wrong on this, right? Because this is going into the realms of philosophical conjecture, in effect. But I would say simply this, that time is a measure of change. So if you imagine a chair in a box, and nothing, not an atom, not a molecule, nothing, not even entropy applies to that chair. Can you say that time has applied to that chair? I would say you cannot, because nothing has changed. And time is effectively just a measure of change, right? So that's how I would philosophically define time. Now, in terms of what happened previous to the Big Bang and how could God have initiated it when, in a way, there's no time for God to initiate anything.
Right. I'm so glad you understand this, at least, because so many people don't. Yeah.
To be perfectly honest, this is a very deep question that actually you either get to when you really look into religion or you really look into atheism. This is the last question at the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah.
Right? And my personal view is that God in the Quran is described as unchanging. God is always all of his attributes are always in operation. And therefore, there is no such thing as God moves from a state of not creating to a state of creating. God is always creating universes. God is always
every new moment.
So God is always creating universes. He's always sustaining universes. He's always destroying universes at every moment of existence. So there is no such thing as God moving from a state of non-existent, not creating, to a state of creating.
But how can you even have the whole idea of creating is something that human beings have had to accept because we cannot imagine a world or a universe without time. Creation itself, the act of creating, cannot exist if you don't have, if time doesn't exist, right? So
I would have such a perfect response to this if I was on the theistic side. But I'm not, so I'm not going to.
Armin, go ahead. It's okay.
No, I'm not going to.
This is like me against you three.
Can I get my answer?
That's what it is. That's it.
I would delineate causality and temporality. So I would delineate causing something and time existing. I don't think you need time in order to cause. You can be causally prior to something, and yet be a timeless entity. Okay, because otherwise that would mean that time didn't exist. If we agree that time exists and it can't be past eternal, can't have always existed, which is, we believe for philosophical reasons, then it is necessary that you believe that there is some kind of cause of that time. And the necessary attribute of the causing entity is that it is timeless.
No,
so
I don't.
Whether we can, sorry, let me just finish. Whether we can conceive of it or not is completely irrelevant. I believe it's logically necessary to believe in an eternal being that is a timeless being which can cause things without itself being in a time stream. And I think the way that I conceive of these things is that ultimately God is always operating in this way. He is always creating. But whether I can conceive of it or not, I think is frankly irrelevant, because that's the logical necessity of the argument.
Yeah, I disagree with that. I don't think that if time doesn't exist, something must have created. I think our field, something, there necessarily has to be a cause for something that exists out of when time doesn't exist. I think that's just something that human nature is. It's something that we can't conceive of, and it's really hard to talk about. When you talk about time has always existed, even a word like always, right? The only reason we use always, the only reason we use beginning or start of the universe is because we are much too familiar with time. The language of time is so deeply ingrained in everything, the way that we. But I wanted to let's go on to this idea of if everything must have a cause, right? So there's that old argument, and everybody's heard about it.
We didn't say everything must have a cause.
Okay, so you said the time must have a cause, but okay.
So go. When you finish what you perceive our arguments being, then if it's right or not, we'll let you know.
Well, no, I mean, one of the biggest questions is that, okay, so God created this, God keeps on creating universes and all of this. What is your answer to that? And this is a very common question, that what created God? Do you believe in this idea of a first cause?
So we believe that everything that came to be must have a cause, i.e., everything that is not eternal, everything that has not always existed must have had a cause. Then we look at, because there has to be something eternal. If we're not saying that something just popped out of non-existence into existence, which I think we both agree is kind of impossible, logically impossible, we have to say that there is something which has always existed, which started off everything else. Then the only question is it the universe? Or do we have to say that there's something prior to the universe? Well, when we look at the universe, and we would say philosophically, and this has been the battle raging for millennia philosophically, that actually, we're on the side of the fence that there has to be an initial cause. Because, for instance, if the universe had always, that would mean that there had been an infinite number of days preceding us.
Infinite regress.
Number of days, how can you add one day to get to today? That would mean that the past is not infinite, which means that there's an initial day, that there's an initial point, and that therefore the past is not eternal. Then we look at it from a scientific view, and we would say, actually, we have the Big Bang Theory, and we have very good reasons for believing that the universe has not always existed, and therefore we say that the eternal entity must have preceded the universe, and it must be something which is, by its nature, uncreated.
Eternal.
Yeah,
right.
Now,
so it has to be eternal.
God. That gets you to an eternal entity that can create.
And it can be anything, yes. So that's a major, as you said, this philosophical thing has been going on for millennia. The only problem is that it assumes this whole idea that it must be eternal, the whole infinite regress, and coming up with the idea that whatever the first cause was is something that is that has to be eternal. That the only problem is that it assumes that time always existed, right? Now, if you actually come up with this idea that when you have the Big Bang, that the time
did
itself
always exist, Ali.
No.
I mean, based on what you just said, like, okay, so there were, when time, there was no time for that. There was no time. So always mean at all times, right? If you translate always at all times, then whenever there was time, there
was time. Okay, I get it. Like, I get.
Do you know what I mean?
Thing you're saying?
Yeah,
but
it's a circular thing.
Yeah, but for the purposes
that's the definition. That depends on the definition of always.
Yeah, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how it's very difficult to talk about this concept, right, without invoking language that has temporal connotations like beginning or like always.
If there was no time, that time did not exist. That means time always existed. There you go.
but you know what I'm talking about, right? We're talking about a time. This is what I was going to say. I was going to say we're talking about a time when time did not exist, which is itself a statement that doesn't make sense. So I think if this is lost on all the audience, forgive me, but I think that you guys know what I'm talking about.
Dwindling.
Right. But what I'm saying is that if you have a concept of a first cause, right, and that is only necessitated when you're talking about infinite regress, if you're assuming that time is eternal. But if we are talking about something like the Big Bang, which was the beginning, quote unquote, beginning of time, right? Then in that case, the whole idea of a first cause becomes unnecessary. You don't even need a first cause because if it is the beginning of time, then there is no before. And any cause and effect relationship at that point, right? At that point is also a temporal thing, I know. But anything at that point just becomes, there's no relation to what happens quote unquote before it or after. I have to say quote unquote so many times. So this is like such a difficult conversation to have on a podcast. Oh my God, yeah.
No, it's good. I like it.
Well, but do you understand what I'm saying, right? Like
I think the thing is you're actually. I'm happy to answer it. There you go. Okay. I think the problem is that you are trying to get something from nothing, and you believe that it's possible.
Yes, I do. I mean, it is possible. I'm not saying it happened. But it is not only philosophically possible, but now there is evidence. There is all the evidence for the Big Bang theory, right? Actually, it shows that it is scientifically possible.
If there was no time before Big Bang, there was never a time that there was nothing. So there were always something. So you never got something from nothing.
Armin, no, that's
no. Listen,
Armin's
no, because there were always something. Because there was no time for the nothingness to exist, so something existed at all times. So there were always something.
Sure, but where did it come from? Do you think the entire universe literally?
Your question doesn't make any sense.
Did it come from?
So what's more?
Your question doesn't make sense because where suggests a space.
Yeah,
where suggests a space, and there was no space.
Okay. No. So can I ask?
Yeah.
There's no space and time. Space and time go together, Armin. Space-time. There was no time either.
Go ahead. It didn't come from anywhere because it was always there.
So can I ask?
Yeah.
Instead of talking about preceding time, let me ask you this question: what seems more logically plausible to you? The existence of a being outside of the influences of time, or the emergence of all existent things with all of their finely tuned laws of nature, matter, and energy in a single moment from nothingness?
Neither of those things. Neither of those things.
The existence of anything outside of time is, as Armin said, it doesn't make sense. You can't have.
Have you guys even considered that nothingness is impossible?
No, so I would agree with you. Nothingness.
We never had nothingness for something to come out of nothing. Maybe the universe, the condition of the universe is for it to always. The existence is a necessary condition of the universe. Have you ever considered that's a possibility? Like how could everybody's asking how could something come from out of nothing? Who suggested that there was ever nothing?
Okay.
Well, the definition of nothing is also very different in physics.
Maybe there was never nothing for something to have come from nothing. Maybe that was not. Maybe we're asking the right questions. Maybe there was always something.
I believe there was always something. That's our entire point. Is that it's logically necessary to believe that there was always something. The question is.
Question doesn't make sense.
Wait, Armin, let him finish. Omar, go ahead.
Yeah. The question is that is our universe that thing which has always been there? Because you're basically arguing very persuasively for the necessity that there is something which is eternal and that there is some kind of necessary existence. The only question is, does our universe fit the bill to be that entity? And we would say a temporal universe that is constantly changing, which we know came from a single point and hasn't always existed by its very nature, was not that necessary and eternal existence. There must be something which is causally prior to this cosmos, which has always existed and which is that necessary existent. The only difference between me and you is that we believe that something was conscious, and we would attribute the characteristics of God to it.
Yeah, which is very strange.
But Armin, based on if you're talking about what you're saying, that time has always existed. That if you're saying time has always existed, then Omer is right. But you're right; it has to be one thing.
I agree with exactly the difference. We both agree on everything, except you guys all of a sudden just bring in consciousness out of nothing. I don't know. I don't where.
That's a step beyond.
We're not making that argument.
The key difference we're making here, the key argument we're making here, is that the universe is contingent. It's not a necessary entity. Because we can imagine a place which isn't this universe.
Well, and empirically and philosophically,
we can. So the question is, what is the necessary existent? And it has to be something which is outside of the scope of the time of this universe. This is something very important. So imagine there are a large number of universes. They all have their own space-time, right? So it's not like time is only in this universe. There are other space-time universes, and time might operate in a different fashion in those universes. So time is not something which is only of one kind of build and suit. It could actually,
but either way, there will be disconnected universes which may have origins themselves, and the necessary existent is a thing which is causally prior to all those things. I use that phrase because I think that eliminates the ambiguity of before or temporality. I just say
all of this discussion is fine, but some of them could be true, some of them could not be true. But I think like all of it is interesting and worthy of considering. But the most ridiculous one that is not even worth considering is the one that all of a sudden adds consciousness to any of this.
Not at all.
So like,
can we explain that?
Can we explain that?
Okay, please do.
So then. Do you want to do it?
No, you go for it. No, you do it. You know this argument better than me. Go for
it. So the question is, what is the nature of that entity? Is it conscious or is it unconscious? Well, for that, then we have to look into the nature of the product of that entity. What is the nature of the universe? Does it give us any hallmarks of requiring prior intelligence? And that's where we would come in with the fine-tuning arguments and say that given that the nature of the universe is specifically set up, it would seem, to produce life or to have the capacity of producing life, that outcome would only be valued by a living being, by a conscious being. And then
you already refuted that.
Actually, the reason why you have the universe specifically set up to produce consciousness is because it's produced by a conscious being which had that intention in mind.
I don't know, because maybe if you say there's many universes, then the only universes where there's a conscious, where living beings came out of it to notice that, oh wow, so it's so extraordinary. We happen to be in a universe that happens to have life. Yeah, because all the universes that didn't have life in them, there was nobody that ended up coming and noticing. There was no conscious living being at the end of it noticing that, hey, holy shit, this universe is not good for us because they didn't end up existing, right?
So, Britain, an article on this, on the rational religion. So, first of all, you're making an argument about the anthropic principle, which is a separate discussion to what we're having, and we've written a really good. Well, I think it's a pretty good article. I wrote it, but it's on rational religion.
Speaking of bias,
yes, exactly. It's on rational religion. It's about the anthropic principle, and it's a problem. It's a completely false argument, actually, in my humble opinion, because at the end of the day, you don't know whether, very humble, yeah. You don't know whether those other universes don't have life in them.
Okay, I want to. If
you have infinite universes, obviously you're going to have some that is going to be perfect for life.
In an atheistic paradigm, yes, but in the paradigm of a designer, no.
So this is about the multiverse.
If you have infinite universes, you're going to have.
That's just another way of saying we disagree. All right.
Okay, so I actually don't. I think that I think we both agree. It depends on the premise. For me, this idea of infinite regress and first cause, again, and despite, to me, that idea of time having different shapes and different universes, that to me is like an extensive amount of speculation. I'm just talking about the way that we recognize time right now. The more ambiguous you get, the more stuff you can kind of come up with. But to me, if you have the infinite regress and the first cause issue is actually addressed by this idea of the Big Bang Theory, the idea that time itself had a quote-unquote beginning. Right, and that changes everything because it changes our notion of causality, and there's actually evidence for it. So I think that's different. But overall, if we go by what you're saying, which is a possibility, again, what I'm talking about again is not established fact. Then we both agree that yes, if there is a first cause, The only question is, and this is what I said right at the beginning, that when it comes to higher intelligence or first whatever, I'm agnostic about that. It could be, it may not be. Where I become atheistic about it is that first cause is, that created this universe of billions of galaxies, time dilation, actually wrote a book and divinely revealed it to a man in the 7th century that talks about, whether you can eat pork or not, or what like those kinds of things to me narrow it down.
So there are two things there. The first thing I would like to ask you a question, which is that given that this universe is contingent and does not have the qualities of a necessary existence, how can you possibly attribute those attributes to this universe? That's the first question. The second point I would like to make, and feel free to answer that if you want now or later.
Sorry, first, can you say the first question again?
Given that this universe is a contingent universe and does not possess the qualities of necessary existence.
According to you.
No. So
according to I'm not saying. So I don't think that this universe necessarily has to be contingent. Okay, this whole because contingency that goes with the infinite regress and the first cause idea, right? And that's not where I lean. I'm just acknowledging that as I think that's obviously a legitimate philosophical argument. I think that this idea of the Big Bang Theory, which I feel has more scientific credibility and scientific evidence behind it, I feel like that can be that actually is a way to contradict the whole idea of the first cause.
We have different view on that. But we don't think they're mutually exclusive. We see the Big Bang just telling us the universe had a beginning, but if it had a beginning to us, it must have had a cause. So it's not a mutually exclusive thing in our view.
We don't.
Well, it's mutually exclusive in the sense.
Guys, we don't. Sorry. We don't know if it was the beginning. That could be. It could have been the end. You guys understand that every single mathematical equation that has t as in there, you don't know which we experience the universe from the beginning, from the Big Bang, and going forward to the very end, where everything all of a sudden becomes separated. But everything could actually be the other way around. Because we're experiencing it in this direction doesn't mean it's necessarily going in that direction.
The Big Bang has been explored by cosmologists. So the Broadbooth-Vilenkin theorem was actually explored this very question: could you have an infinite number of universes, one after the other, creating an eternal meta-universe? And they found out that it couldn't, because essentially it runs out of entropy.
Right. I wanted to kind of get away from the...
No, that's not what I was saying, but okay.
Yeah, but I wanted to get away from the philosophical aspect of it, but you said that those things are not, for you, they're not mutually exclusive. For me, they can be. And the reason they can be is because the beginning of the universe, right, is not, again, it's not just the creation of space and matter, it's also the creation of time. Time and space are interlinked. So I think because of that, the fact that time itself could have had the beginning, that breaks down this whole idea of any contingency. Contingency does not exist. There's no such thing as contingency if there was a time when time did not exist, which is, I know, a sentence that...
So my first answer to you was that God exists outside of time, and time is a measure of change, and God is unchanging. And that solves the problem of the concept of...
It doesn't.
So that, to my mind, I should say, solves the problem of the problem which you're posing, which is something which
can I tell you why it doesn't?
Wait. Armin, let Tahir finish.
Something which is causally prior should also be causally in terms of should be bound in the same time stream. The second point I just want to is completely separate to this, and I think we should move on from this to a certain extent, because you made a really interesting point earlier, Ali, which is that why would God be interested in sending this book to the 7th century Arab, blah, 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 that kind of thing, right? Which kind of strikes me as that argument I've heard a few times.
The first cause, not God. But the first cause, whatever this eternal thing is, which again, I don't lean towards that, but yeah.
Why would he, often the question is asked where this tiny pale blue dot on an absolute enormously vast cosmos, right? Why would
that's not it. No, that's not the question is tiny pale blue dot, fine. Somehow he found it. He's like, okay, I'm going to put my headquarters here, whatever. That's okay. That's part I actually don't have an issue with. I'm talking about the nature of the revelation. There's hundreds of billions of galaxies, there's time dilation, there's binary pulsars, there's black holes where time is non-existent, all of this stuff. And then the creator of a universe of all of this is sending us revelations about, a fish that swallowed a man, or a man who flew on a winged horse, or these strange sort of very human-like Aesop's fables, Greek mythology-like ideas.
Because at the end of the day, you ascribe a particular value to pulsars and black holes and so on and so forth, higher than the stories which lead to moral progress.
Then a man and a fish, yes.
Yes, because at the end of the day, you're not looking at it from God's perspective, right? To him, a binary star is boring compared to a living organism which has consciousness and free will.
I don't know about that.
And
you
no,
guys seem to know a lot about what God likes and doesn't like.
No, it naturally has to be. Because at the end of the day, what is more valuable than a being that is conscious? There is nothing in the universe that is more interesting than that. And even if we are only 5'10" or 6 feet, when you have a petri dish,
we're Asians. We're not.
when you have a petri dish and it's full of empty space and rubbish and debris and physical chemical processes, and you have a single cell organism in the middle, you don't stare at the empty bits on the petri dish. You look at the cell, even though it occupies the smallest volume in that petri dish.
And that is the purpose of your entire experiment, was to create that being that could ultimately know you. And the way it did that was through following a spiritual and moral path.
Okay.
Yeah,
Armin.
I just think he did a very poor job at communicating anything with us. Given that we have had this like all these discussions for thousands of years, shows that if God like wrote a manual the same as like United Nations or Amnesty International, if you look at their guidebooks, it's very much more clear and very much well
everyone follows them, right? All the major powers follow the UN laws.
No, but I'm just saying at least there's some understanding about what is being said, even if it's not perfect.
You're missing the point again. I mean, God is not writing these books or dictating these books.
Oh yeah, he's playing games with us. It's like, if you want me, you have to come.
He's not.
You have to solve these puzzles. To be able to get
he's not writing these books as a proof that he exists. He's writing these books as an evidence for you to pursue a particular path so that God should then reveal himself.
He's like a girl that wants to make it difficult. Like, if you have to earn me.
You know, you can tell him yourself one day.
So, guys, I have to. I'm so sorry, but
can I say one last thing? One last question. How is it that we can have these conversations on atheists and Muslims with you guys without any degree of hostility and enjoy it as well? And why is it so difficult to have these conversations? Like, why is it that some atheists can't have these conversations with other Muslims, and a lot of other Muslims find atheists that disagree with them hostile, and a lot of atheists find all Muslims, to be, hostile towards. Like, why is it that we are able to do this, and how could we get other people to have, even if we don't change, even if we don't change each other's opinions, we are able to have fun having these discussions, and we don't think less of each other just because we disagree. How can we do more of this?
We recognize the value in each other.
How can we?
There's a mutual respect.
I think that's actually, to me, and the answer to this question is more important than the God question, right? How could we get more people to accept each other and accept their disagreements with each other, and be able to even find beauty in discussing their disagreements with each other without hating each other?
Well, it's a deep question. I mean, this is ultimately from our perspective as religious people. Our whole directive from God is to, we believe, spread peace, spread goodwill and civility, and treat each other decently. All religions, not just Islam, we believe, teach you to do that. So this is part of our religious training, and it's a religious injunction upon us, is to debate with each other in a goodly manner. That's what the Quran says. It says, to talk to them in a goodly manner with people that disagree with you. So we're trying to fulfill that, and what we try and do is try and promote that, because as you say, there are lots of religious people who don't have that approach. And I'm sure, and this is clearly what you're doing in your podcast, is to show people that don't believe in God that also you can engage in this way. And the best proof of concept is an example. That's what proof of concept is to actually demonstrate that this is possible. And that's what you've done very ably in this podcast itself, is to show that people can have different views, but actually discuss it and enjoy it nonetheless, and hopefully have more conversations after this as well.
And so have you. So we really appreciate that. And we've talked a lot about beginnings and ends in this and time. So speaking of time, I wish that time didn't exist. Okay, that doesn't make sense, because that means that we would have more time. Yeah, see, there you go. That's how difficult this is to talk about. But guys, thank you very much. I would love to follow up. There's so much more stuff I have to talk to you about.
Absolutely.
But this is, again, great website.
Mention the website one more time.
rationalreligion.co.uk. It is... Yeah, and it's a great website, not because I agree with everything in it. but because I think that you have done something that we always try to do is be aware of the other side's arguments, like understand them, acknowledge them in kind, counter them, and really have a discussion that way. And I really appreciate that, and that's why it really was amazing to have you guys on the show.
Yeah.
And
if you'd like to have these discussions with them, just go find their YouTube channel, subscribe to their YouTube channel, and comment there and have a discussion about these topics.
That's very kind of you.
Thank you very
Armin.
much. We really appreciate it.
And you know what? We would love to have this discussion with you guys again.
Yeah, we would love to do that. I would call you, but I have to say one thing. There's going to be response to this podcast by saying, well, they're Ahmadi Muslims and most Muslims don't consider them this and that. That's not what we're talking about. This is not about purposely. We did not make this a debate because we didn't want to have sides. We wanted to have a conversation, and we wanted to just present all of you guys with it. So there's no winner, loser, whatever. And well, of course, there's a winner. The winner's us because it's our podcast. But no, I'm kidding. There's nothing like that. This is just a conversation, and we're talking about the content. It doesn't matter, where they're from or who they're quoting. Like the idea is that you'll see that what we talked about over here was ideas, and it's not a point of where it's coming from. So just wanted to preempt that ahead of time. And I think that most Muslims, mainstream non-Ahmadi Muslims, should appreciate the arguments you gave because I find them at least a better, even though I don't agree with them necessarily, but I find them better arguments for their side, right? Than their people are making. Like we've had people on this show who've made absolutely ridiculous arguments. So I think that this was a lot of fun. It's a good discussion. I think Armin will probably agree, though I don't want to speak for him. I know not to do that.
This was 2 hours of more fun than I could have had doing anything else. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Anything else? Boy, that's a big...